In order to perceive, we must move. But in order to move, we also must perceive.
Modern Western culture implicitly builds on the separation between the brain and the body. For example, we tend to focus the development of human potential via specialization. Athletes achieve amazing physical prowess, but they leave intellectual pursuits to others, to their managers or to professionals. While knowledge workers spend hours and hours sitting on their chairs indoors, working their minds while their bodies largely atrophy. Ancient societies preferred a more hybrid approach and were intuitively skeptical of this mind-body split. The ancient Greeks were aware of the pitfalls of this. Thucydides, for example, once wrote a quote that I love: "The society that separates its scholars from its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools." Much of our approach in this separation of the brain and the body comes from French philosopher René Descartes, whose famous line, "I think, therefore I am," not only holds the view that minds and bodies are separate things, but that the mind and abstract thinking are somewhat superior to bodily sensations and physical movement. But since the 1980s, neuroscientists at a lot of top institutions around the world have been working on a new model, one they call embodied cognition. And they look at the ways in which brains and bodies are actually deeply intertwined. I mean, they were always physically connected to us, but they're part of the same process. And they're really, both of them, just different nodes in one holistic system of cognition and physical embodiment. And they're finding all kinds of really cool connections between the two. As small examples, one large Scandinavian study found that cardiovascular fitness best predicted cognitive performance. Another study found that gesturing, so making little physical gestures, helped people, particularly children, complete difficult puzzles at a higher rate. And another one found that small postural changes can almost instantly affect our hormone levels. So we're just scratching the surface of this exciting new mind-body paradigm. And it's very clear that it's not "I think, therefore I am." It's "I am, therefore I move and I think." To help me make sense of this, I interviewed Dr. Michael Mannino, a great young neuroscientist and philosopher who's deeply involved in cutting-edge research using this perspective. He combines neuroscience, computer modeling, and AI tools to find new connections between the way we move, the way we think, and the way we perform all kinds of different tasks. He's a true encyclopedia of knowledge, and what's really cool with Michael is that his philosophy background allows him to relate some of these new scientific findings to age-old questions that we've had as a species, like what does it mean to be a human being, how to forge an authentic spiritual connection with others or even with the world around us. In the age of AI, it seems like these old questions are getting more relevant, not less. Michael is also the chief science officer at the Flow Research Collective. And so we discussed some of his exciting new research on group flow, which led to him developing a new technology product that he's launching soon to help groups and teams better achieve flow states together and achieve new levels of performance and enjoyment. This conversation bridges philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, and spirituality. And in my view, Michael is the kind of new school scholar that can really best help us understand how science and technology interface with the human experience and help us redefine what it means to be human and how to optimize our well-being. I learned a ton in this one, and I hope you all enjoy it. Here is Dr. Michael Mannino. For people who don't know you, so you're a philosopher. You're a young guy, but you're a philosopher. And I don't mean this in a kind of a vague, wishy-washy way. You're actually a philosopher. You're a highly rated professor of philosophy at University of Miami-Dade, which I always feel like they should just change it to Wade, like top to bottom. You know, like they did it during the playoffs, but they should just go Wade all the way. But you're also an applied neuroscientist. So Your research area focuses on computational neuroscience, so modeling complex brain networks, like real data-driven, peer-reviewed neuroscience. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think you entered neuroscience only after studying philosophy, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, largely because I thought and still think that a lot of the problems from philosophy and that are studied within philosophy will be answered or are being answered now when we fully understand the brain and how it functions and how it relates to a body, as we'll get into, right? I guess, but was a large inspiration. In fact, like some professional philosophers, Paul and Patricia Churchland, they're well-known physicalists, actually, in the philosophy of mind. They're big, prominent philosophers in the philosophy of mind. They came up with this idea of neurophilosophy and where philosophy needs to go from here into the brain. So that was inspired by that, and then it was also inspired just by the questions that I was asking in philosophy itself. What is consciousness? What is the mind? And I thought that philosophers try to answer that question, but neuroscientists, philosophers need a good understanding of neuroscience to answer those questions. And then, so that's sort of the content intellectual side of it. The practical side of it for me personally was brain computer, the practical application of it, right? Like brain computer interface, the intersection of artificial intelligence and neuroscience. And there's the technology that's coming out now. There's much more, momentum and progress in the field of neuroscience and how that's just going to change our lives as well. Like, for example, I'll just give you a really cool example. A study just came out last week or 2 weeks ago showing that we can now read people's thoughts using artificial intelligence by just reading their neural activity in their brains, putting them in a brain scanner, scanning their brains when they're watching a movie or looking at a story or reading a story. And the non-invasive, the artificial intelligence can just get the gist of the story, the narrative that they're reading, or the story of the movie that they're watching just by reading their brain activity. So that's like why, that practical, scary, but sort of optimistic side is one of the big reasons that I switched from philosophy into neuroscience.
Wow, that's crazy. So you guys can actually track, let's say, the playing out of a story inside the brain, and you can map that out in a way that the subject, like, you guys present that information to the subject and kind of validate it after with what was actually going on in their minds?
Yeah, good question. So this is actually called brain reconstruction. And it's actually been it's about like 5 to 10 years old. Originally, I think this comes out of Jack Gallant's lab in San Francisco. But yeah, you basically put people in scanners, have them watch visual information like a movie, and then we can reconstruct what they're watching. Now it's pretty good. Back then it was pretty crude. Now it's pretty good in terms of the resolution. So if you're seeing a plane, that has a specific neural representation, a specific neural activity or neural markers that are associated with you watching that plane, and we can read that information and then reconstruct it. And then, yes, afterwards validate. Not only that, it's more profound than that. You can actually think up your own stories, and then the AI can reconstruct what you're thinking and the story that you're telling yourself. Same with handwriting. Like AI can now reconstruct. You can just think about writing an A, and then the AI will like put an A on the screen, for example.
That's crazy. So that's like the beginnings of like mind reading in a lot of ways. Like with the technology interface, eventually it's mind reading. That's kind of
mind reading.
What it seems.
It's mind reading, and not only that. Think about this. What we can do now, and what we will be able to do very soon. You put people in scanners, go to sleep, have a couple dreams, and then we'll play your dreams on a video.
Oh my God, that's so cool. That's awesome. That's crazy.
It's pretty cool. Imagine the therapeutic uses of that. Imagine like the possibilities with that. Yeah.
So we're going to dive into some of this stuff just on a general sort of approach level. So the way you presented it, you were studying philosophy, you were asking all these different questions about the brain, about consciousness. Then you realized that a lot of the answers can come from neuroscience. Is that the way you see it? So like almost like philosophy is like proto-science in a way. It's a way for us to try to start to grapple with different questions that eventually will be answered by science? Or do they kind of overlap to where they're exploring the same problems, maybe with different tools that also have some validity to it?
I see it as both, but mostly actually the latter. So philosophy is a second order kind of thinking, right? And I'll give you an example of that in a second, but it's a metacognitive sort of second order thinking. And philosophy can give you the tools and the critical thinking and the skills to be able to do things that, let's say, neuroscientists can't. And so I'll give you two examples, and then I'll get into the directionality between philosophy and neuroscience. Okay, it's in that particular domain. Take science. So scientists, right, they are neuroscience, like just in neuroscientists in particular, but scientists in general use the hypothetical deductive method, right? They go on test hypotheses. They try and figure out what's real in the world and try and uncover laws. A philosopher will come in and say, well, what is special about your methodology that differentiates it between another method of knowledge acquisition? What is a law, right? What is a hypothesis? Why, Karl Popper, right? Why can hypotheses be only falsified and not proven, right? What's going on there? Like, scientists don't ask that question. Philosophers of science ask those questions, and those are distinct questions that need different sorts of reasoning and rationality, I think, to approach that. Science is a really interesting thing itself. In philosophy of science, there's two views. There's one called scientific realism, and then there's another one called scientific anti-realism. And so scientific realism says, look, science works because it's really uncovering the actual truth of the universe, like what's really out there that's independent of the mind. And it works. It's functional. Like, we can fly planes, we can heal people, we can figure out the germ, right? Those kinds of things. It makes progress. Scientific anti-realists, philosophers of science that are anti-realists, come in and say, well, true, but science changes. So maybe there's no real such thing as scientific progress, right? The phlogiston theory was replaced by the caloric theory of heat. Newton's theory was replaced by relativity and Einstein. And so maybe it's just sort of a replacing. And then you have people on the far end of the spectrum, a guy named Paul Feyerabend, who thinks that in the philosophy of science, thinks that actually there's no rules. Anything goes. He calls it epistemological anarchism. That is, like, we really have scientists don't really have any set of rules and guidelines and methods and processes they follow. So that's a good example, like the scientific method. People thought, oh my God, there's a fixed scientific method, and if we follow that method, we're just going to figure out how the universe works. But then people came in, like Thomas Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and other people said, wait a second.
The paradigmatic.
Exactly.
Like, all of small science operates within a paradigm, operates within like known methods and known ways of doing things. But then sometimes you realize, that the paradigm itself imposes certain assumptions, imposes a certain frame on reality that we can question, that we can we
can't get out of.
We can't get out of. And to transcend the paradigm, we have to do something other than sort of, let's call it little science, or just the experiments, or just figuring out, like setting up experiments with the assumptions of the paradigm in the background.
That's right, exactly. He said, so like the scientific method is maybe not so fixed and rigorous. Maybe it's more messy and more back and forth and more human. And so he was a philosopher of science. So he asked those questions about what the scientists are actually doing. I think there is something special about science personally that makes it very unique in terms of our ways of understanding reality and how the world really is. That is, I want to say, better. It's different, but maybe better for certain purposes in terms of like understanding reality. So I think Thomas Kuhn said, all observations are theory laden. In other words, when you go and observe something under a microscope, blood under a microscope, or germ under a microscope, or a black hole or a star or something like that, you're making that observation through the lens of the theory that you already that came to like discover that. So now I don't think that's true.
There are assumptions, almost like they're like you have little assumptions built into your very act of cognition, your very act of perceiving something.
Correct. Yes, exactly. Is shaped by, and we know this. Neuroscientists know this very well now at the level of the brain. Perception is shaped by your mood, your language that you speak, the culture that you're from, your physiological state, your expectations, your beliefs about the world, all of those. So perception is an active, constructive process. The brain doesn't record reality like a one-to-one camera. But science is the one thing, I believe, that gets us past that. It's the most objective, logical thing I think that we have to get us at what reality really is like. And I think there is a reality out there that is mind independent.
I think this is a really nice seg also to get into the brain body connection. But I'm curious to know if you would add a caveat to that, which is science properly construed as a process where the assumptions and the hypotheses that we have in how we set up the experiment are made transparent and very clearly kind of laid out, right? And not sort of implied, which I think proper scientific methodology imposes that.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I really don't think there's anything such like an official thing called the scientific method. It's a process. It's just an attitude, really. I think that's what distinguishes that. It's a way of coming at the world that is just, you want to figure things out, how it works. And so there's an attitudinal disposition or inclination to that, I think. And the method can change.
Maybe like not predetermining the outcome or just being open to where the experiment goes.
Correct. Confirmation bias, wishful thinking. The scientific attitude cuts that. That's the beauty of critical thinking, I think, in my critical thinking, which is I'm very passionate about and I teach. And so going back to your question real quick about philosophy and neuroscience. So there's neurophilosophy and then there's philosophy of neuroscience. And there's a distinction there. So neurophilosophy is trying to use neuroscience, the findings of modern cognitive computational neuroscience, to answer philosophical questions. What is the self? What is selfhood? Right? Is memory involved? Well, now we know about the default mode network in brain science. How can we solve the mind-body problem? Well, let's look to some of these experiments in neuroscience. So can we answer philosophical questions with the findings and results of neuroscience? Philosophy of neuroscience is a little bit different. So the idea there is that use the concepts and methods and things and tools from philosophy to help clarify and interpret the data and results in neuroscience. I'll give you an example. I wrote a paper myself and my advisor on causality in the brain. And so neuroscientists doing experiments and showing, look, this part of the brain back here causes this part of the brain to become active. And so there's a causality in the brain, but they never really considered like the rich philosophical literature and thinking that Aristotle, David Hume, Bertrand Russell did about what causality is. So maybe we can use some of that thinking to help interpret the results from the data from the fMRI experiments that neuroscientists are doing. That's philosophy of neuroscience.
And have you witnessed that being done productively in terms of enriching the experiments that you'll do in neuroscience or maybe interpreting the results?
Yeah, not enough, I think. And Patricia Churchland, I think, makes this point well, is that, and Sam Harris, I'll throw in there too, I don't think enough. I think neuroscientists need to pay more attention to, how to think philosophically and some of the philosophical theories out there and concepts. I think they need to pay more attention to that. I think philosophers are now starting to pay much more attention, thanks to those people's work, of what we're finding out on neuroscience, but probably not enough on that direction either.
Interesting. So an area where we can maybe find some progress or maybe more emphasis on that area. So I want to start from the top with you, and I mean literally the top, the brain. So the act of thinking, right? There's this idea that's been enormously popular in the West, namely that everything that we are is inside the brain, that the act of thinking is, the only source of the self, the source of our identity, all of our thoughts, it all happens up here. In your TED Talk, you take a brain, I don't know if that probably wasn't a real brain, just a mock-up, and you said, here you are, right? Like, this is all of you. And it is like, philosophically, this is the famous Descartes dictum, right? I think, therefore I am. But there's another way to look at cognition that's at the root of a lot of your work, namely that we are and have always been brains in a body. And so you've opened up my mind to the view, I think you expressed it this way once, that brains didn't evolve just for thinking, but they evolved to optimize the movement of the organism in the outside world. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you conceive of the brain and our thoughts on one hand being connected to the body and this notion of embodied cognition?
Yeah. So I would change Descartes' dictum not to "I think, therefore I am," but "I move, therefore I am." And I think that's a little bit more relevant. And it's interesting too, because embodied cognition is not just neuroscience meaning in the brain, but embodied cognition is an overlapping interdisciplinary field of research that involves cognitive science, culture, anthropology, philosophy, especially, and neuroscience and computer science and things like that. But yeah, I think it's overwhelmingly clear now that brains evolved from movement first, and out of that came mental states. One of the first people to think about this was Rudolfo Linas, who wrote a book called Eye of the Vortex, From Neurons to Self. And the idea there is that he really was one of the first to sort of theorize about this, that brains are prediction engines. The brains evolve from movement, right? If there's no brain, if there's no central nervous system, there's no movement. But when you move, you have to make predictions about your environment, what's going to be around that bush, your way your body's moving in relation to the environment. And so you need to start making predictions about things. And so that's from an evolutionary perspective. And so now we know that the brains really are these at the heart of how brains work is this sense of prediction. It's about predicting what was going to be the outcome of your body's movement on the world, on the environment, and how the environment's going to respond, and then what you need to do to optimize that for survival. That's an evolutionary perspective. Now we think of embodied cognition as really, it's just that embodied cognition and embodied consciousness is really the view that the body plays a central role in shaping cognitive processes, and even maybe the nature of consciousness itself. The body and how it moves in the world and how it interacts with the environment, and the fact that it's coupled to the environment. When I say cognition and cognitive processes, I mean thinking, like you said, decision-making, perception, attention, emotional regulation, like those kinds of things. I refer to as cognition or cognitive processes. So that's the view there, that consciousness it's not only in our head. We have to think about consciousness not as something that's up in our heads with, and there's a neural brain activity that you can say correlates with the experience of consciousness or consciousness as experience. No, we think that consciousness is something that we do, we enact, or that we embody. And so this idea of this perception action cycle. In fact, J.J. Gibson said, I put this in my TED Talk too, in order to perceive, we must move. But in order to move, we also must perceive.
So do you subscribe to this bi-directional model? So it's not just there's the way that you move changes maybe the way that your cognition works, but also mindset effects or belief effects, or like what we have like around placebo effects, like also the way that you'll think will also affect the body.
100%, yes. And the reason those things exist is not because there's two things and they're connected. It's just there's one thing. And that's a philosophical view that I think is largely being confirmed with neuroscience. So, right, in philosophy of mind, you're a dualist. You could be
again, Descartes, like he's like, there's two substances. There's the mind, and then there's what would you call this? Okay, if it's really one thing with maybe two modalities that are playing off each other like this, what would you call that philosophically, or in the world of ideas? Like, what's that? Is it some form of monism, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good call. I think there's a word. There's a couple of titles. I think emergent physicalism. So it's a physicalism. Yeah,
it's a nice one. Sounds nice and complex and kind of scientific. Sounds.
I think emergent physicalism is the view, and I haven't studied this in a while, but it's a physicalist view. But that mental states, mind, right, is explainable through physical things, neurons, brain firings, brain cells, but are not reducible to neurons. You can't reduce an emotion to neurons firing, but you can explain it through that, and now through this idea of dynamical coupling. I think the brain is a dynamical system. And we can get into that, but so that's not just an information processing thing that produces consciousness, right? It's this dynamical embodied system that interacts with the environment, and out of that coupling, that interaction emerges and is emergent property of like, consciousness, let's say, or sensation, let's say. Like that comes from complex adaptive systems too.
I think this is a really, it's a really big idea, I think, that really kind of transcends a lot of our models, like the regular models that people have when they think of the brain, when they think of thinking. And I think as I was grappling with your work and with the different ideas involved in it, I'm like, this is like, perhaps in the words of Kuhn, like, this is perhaps a new paradigm that's emerging. It's maybe like, it's bigger than just like just another idea. It's really, really big. And I'm like, okay, so a lot of things that you just said now, you said, the thinking is not just in the brain, it's an embodied process.
Fred, you hit the nail on the head. It's thinking and consciousness and cognition. It's clear that that's not just in the head. It's not just in the head, right? It can't be reducible to neurons firing. I think that's pretty clear. And I think there's plenty of experiments and things that are data that are coming out now that sort of really illustrate that and demonstrate that. One study that came out recently showed that, let's see if I can describe it right. But so like gestures, right? So I'll give you two experiments. Gestures are a really good example, I think, of embodied cognition. So the meaning of words, right? They trained people to translate foreign words, and in one group, and then in another group, they did the same thing, but they were using gestures and body movements to like associate with those words. Of course, the people in the second group remembered the translation of those words better. But not only that, when they put those people in brain scanners and they asked them, and you're not moving in a brain scanner, you're just like, you're stationary. When they asked those people in brain scanners to translate the words that they had learned with the movements, parts of their brain that were lighting up that were not involved in the memory, but involved in movement, body movement and gestures. And then in another experiment, they actually asked people to think about the sizes of objects and compare the sizes of objects with brain scanners on. Like, so cup or broom, and then objects that were not manipulable but really huge, like lamppost or building. And in one experiment, they had them restrain their hand movements, but able to look at their hands. And then in the other one, they were able to freely not move their hand. They were able to freely move their hands, but they were still told to just keep them down. But they were able to move them if they wanted to. And so the bottom line is they found that when you constrain people's hand movements, they have difficulty understanding the semantic meaning, the semantic content of the sizes of objects. When you restrict people's body movements, they have trouble not only like identifying the sizes of objects, but understanding the meaning of the sizes of objects when they think about them.
Wow. I'm just curious, is your proud Italian heritage part of the reason why you're so passionate about all this research about gestures and cognition?
Possibly there's some transgenerational epigenetic component to
It's Mannino, not Mannino, okay? Don't Americanize my name.
Possibly, yes.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
When I think of this idea of like the embodied, like it happens like all over the body, or maybe like different parts of the body are contributing to the emergent reality of consciousness. I think also of something that a lot of scientific-minded people are very skeptical of. So all the literature around chakras and things like the kind of like very new agey. And I understand a lot of these people, like when they start talking about science and they start going into the quantum realm, a lot of people roll their eyes and they're not like impressed with that. And on the other side, I think a lot of academics, like, what do they do all day? They sit and they think. Like they're not hiking, they're not fighting, they're not super connected to their bodies, it doesn't seem. But from your perspective, this idea that cognition happens in many places in the body. So I don't know, I think of like an energy center where there's a lot of neural connections, like the heart or the gut or these other major sort of centers in the body. It would seem to me that in an embodied consciousness frame, that it would be maybe a little bit easier to conceive of something like, like the chakra literature or something like that, right?
Yeah, well, Fred, you just definitely lit up something in my thinking right there. Yes, possibly. Yeah. There's very interesting, science out there that is now sort of like revamping or maybe giving a little bit more validation or credence to some of these older views, by the way, just in general. Some of those things it's confirming and validating, and then science disconfirms and invalidates other things, right? Even within the same framework, right? And I want to emphasize it's not only that the body plays a major central and constitutive role in forming consciousness and cognition and thinking and decision making and that kind of thing, but it's also movement, right? It's the way the body interacts with the world and shapes the world. And I cup an ear to hear better, and that kind of thing. So it's the environment too that then shapes us. So it's this bidirectional coupling. It's like that's the key word, right? It's a relational thing.
It's a relational thing with the environment. So it's not just ever in the body. So it's a much more multifaceted phenomenon than just like neurons firing in the brain. It's not just the body, but it's also the environment.
Yeah, it's a brain, body, environment, system, and coupling. Out of that comes this self-organization thing of consciousness and cognition. That's what I would say. Back to a little bit of a personal story. I started with Eastern philosophy, right? So I started with, that's what really was passionate. I was passionate about Zen Buddhism. I was passionate about Zen philosophy and Eastern ways of thinking. Then I got into Western philosophy. I ended up doing my master's in Western philosophy. And what really inspired me way back now, is this connection between quantum physics and consciousness. So quantum consciousness, that's what I was like, wow, you have quantum physics, which is incredibly crazy and mind-blowing, and we can't still interpret the results yet. Still many open unanswered questions. And people were like trying to explain consciousness with that. Like we shape our own reality. And I was really into that movement, really, really into it.
The Joe Dispenza stuff of like, you enter the quantum realm and then everything is possible.
Yep, Gary Zukov, Fred Alan Wolf, these were actual physicists and neuroscientists who studied these kinds of things. And then there were and then Erwin Schrödinger. My God, Erwin Schrödinger, one of the fathers of quantum physics, wrote a book called What is Life that enormously inspired me. Created molecular biology with that book, pretty much. And Erwin Schrödinger was a guy who studied the Upanishads and Vedic texts and tried to himself. Werner Heisenberg wrote a book called Physics and Philosophy. Werner Heisenberg, of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics.
And Breaking Bad.
And Heisenberg in Breaking Bad, the black hat. Good. So those guys were really inspiring to me. And I think there's still a lot of open answered questions. And then I wrote a book. I read a book called Zen in the Brain by Austin. So this understanding of Zen philosophy by looking at neuroscience. And so I got into Western philosophy, got my master's in Western philosophy with a little bit of little learning from the East as well still. And then it became clear, I think, that there was no quantum mechanics and quantum physics, how interesting it is. It really doesn't have much to say about consciousness. I think people still disagree. Roger Penrose, Stuart Hameroff. There's quantum realm and there's the classical realm, and I think we have to think about consciousness in the classical realm. Maybe non-locality, superposition, entanglement, uncertainty. All of those things do matter for consciousness, but maybe not. It's certainly not in the way that people were thinking about, the Joe, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, the Joe Dispenzas that continue to promulgate these ideas. I think that's been largely, overwhelmingly. We've moved on from that.
It's hard to follow those leaps sometimes, right?
In my opinion.
Yeah, of course. I mean, who knows ultimately, but it's hard to follow those leaps that these things happen in the quantum realm, and then this is what it means to you. It's like, well, that's kind of a huge leap, right? I mean, we can use things as metaphors. We can maybe approach certain environmental challenges or personal challenges through the use of metaphors or certain ideas, but it doesn't sort of necessarily dictate. If you're going to apply a little bit more scientific scrutiny to it, sometimes it's hard to follow that chain. And for me, it kind of invalidates. And then oftentimes it'll be connected to certain practices that could be maybe amazing, in their own right. But it's like the theoretical chain and then the practice. And then I'm just like, okay, I don't really understand.
I just think we should keep those things separate. That's all. We shouldn't try and explain one with the other because it's turned out pretty fruitless and pretty empty. Anyway, to answer your question, the metaphysics of it, right? Like there's a lot of different metaphysical systems of explanation. There's scientific systems of explanation. And in my opinion, those two things diverge. They diverge quite starkly and quite profoundly when trying to explain reality. And some of the but science is now confirming meditation, the contemplative neuroscience, the neuroscience of meditation is now really answering a lot of very interesting questions that people thousands of years knew. Transgenerational epigenetics is another field that's like, wow, like there are deep connections of our ancestors, and we're going to learn a lot more things. But now back to like certain metaphysical, but even within metaphysical, like this was the problem. I read a book called The Tao of Physics by Friedrich Capra. And that book enormously inspired me. And he tries in that book to connect Eastern mysticism with quantum physics. But even within Eastern mysticism itself, you have, with one view, you have like differing ideas and philosophies and theologies. So like, again, it's hard to like extrapolate and match those things. More, what we're actually doing is like, we're coming with confirmation bias. We're coming to the world with what we want to be true and figuring out what we know to try and say, yep, look, that's true, rather than the scientific outlook and the scientific attitude is coming to the world like, let's figure out let's keep an open mind, let's figure out what's true. And if it disagrees with some of our deeply held worldviews, we have to accept that. And that's been shown, I think, time and time again, right? Like Darwin with evolution, like, you know, separated, like humanity's at the top, it's qualitatively distinct. Nope, we're not a matter of difference in degree. We're not a difference in kind, we're just a difference in degree, and we're part of this entire ecosystem. You know, Copernicus did it with taking the sun, you know, the Earth out of the center of the solar system. And, you know, the sun is the center of the solar system, and we're just one solar system now among many of hundreds of, you know, billions of exoplanets out there in many galaxies. Like, you know, I think there's a lot of times science cuts through the anthropomorphism, in my view, that people like, you know, who have with quantum physics have followed that sort of followed that way of thinking. So with chakras, that's a global level answer. Let's get back to your specific question about chakras and things like that. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that, you know, there are different parts of the body that may not hold like memories and aspects of our personality. That's up here and that has to be thought of, but we can't make the distinction now with embodied cognition, right? And so in some ways, embodied cognition actually aligns more with chakra philosophy, right? And in many ways, it might be metaphorical, but it's that way of thinking that embodied cognition may confirm.
Yeah, that's it. Like after that, like we sort of layer this representational model, right? That's kind of like has a lot of theory built into it. Who knows how much of it is true, how much of it is not true, right? But I'm thinking also with embodied cognition, it's such a rich frame because something like, for instance, like meditation, okay, where you're doing something with your body, you're doing something with your mind, you emerge from it with a meaningful experience. I remember personally when people who were scientifically minded thought that was all like new agey like bullshit, okay? And it turns out today, as you've said, like it's been proven. Now we can neuroscientifically prove that a lot is going on with meditation, and then all the sort of the benefits, the well-being, concentration, stress, anxiety, all of that. So it turns out that the people who sort of held on to that as a meaningful experience were correct. In a sense, they were more scientific because they were embodied in their cognition. They had a meaningful experience. The theoretical models of science at the time didn't fit with their experience, but they believed in their experience. It was like empirical.
Oh yeah. Oh yes.
So it's like more scientific almost than like, well, you know, the scientific sounding theory of the world. Yeah, but that's just a theory. Who knows? That's just a paradigm. Maybe eventually we're going to completely transcend that paradigm.
So that's the anti-realist position. And this extrapolates too. Like this extrapolates to things like psychedelics, right? And it extrapolates to like even like cosmological things. Like quantum physics is really weird and we don't know how to interpret it yet, right? And we don't know what consciousness is. We may have some good ideas, right? But we don't know how consciousness fits within the paradigm of the universe, or whether the universe is conscious itself, Like one of the biggest theories of one of the biggest, if not the biggest scientific theory of consciousness that exists right now, which is enormously rigorous, highly mathematical, is called integrated information theory. And it was started by Julio Tononi. Anil Seth, one of my colleagues, actually writes about that quite well in his new book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. Integrated information theory looks at information theory and looks at the integration of different parts of a system, and it quantifies consciousness. And it comes up with a quantifiable metric. It's called phi. And so consciousness is quantifiable. A lot of consciousness, high phi. Low consciousness, like maybe an amoeba, low phi. But more than that, it's almost like panpsychist in its view, and that is like that everything in the universe, atoms, my phone, right? Like everything has some level of consciousness. We don't have any answers to that. That's a really weird, very Eastern, in some Eastern, not other Eastern, way of thinking.
It's also interesting how people who deny that human beings have consciousness, like hard physicalists, like the world is closed onto physics and there's no place for consciousness and just physical laws, and you'll do like zombie theory of man, what I call it, right? Very often we'll say, well, look, animals don't have consciousness, rocks don't have. What makes you think a human being has consciousness? In a sense, that's more comfortable for them to consider that than the opposite alternative, that maybe all of these other things also have consciousness, right?
Right, the opposite. Right, yeah, exactly. It's the opposite, and it's more comfortable to like sort of think. I mean, but even not only neuroscience, which is dealing with the brain, of course, but like even cosmology and astronomy, like the Big Bang. Now we're going beyond the Big Bang with like the James Webb Telescope. Figuring out, like looking at the birth of the universe. When I put that in quotes, like we still don't understand questions like what is the edge of the universe? Is there edge of the universe? Are there other universes, like a multiverse that exists? Are there other, this exact situation happening now in other universes? Those are very unanswered. In other words, the empirical method, the beauty of the scientific method that we discussed earlier to find and figure out how reality works is itself like with quantum physics, relativity, neuroscience, like tearing those boundaries down. And so like it almost does borderline into like really different ways of West, thinking than the West, like the Eastern ways and Eastern philosophies. So
yeah, and it's almost like the branch of philosophy, like metaphysics, right? It's also if you're thinking literally of like what happened, let's say pre-Big Bang or the edge of the universe, those questions by definition will be metaphysical because it's not something that you can measure today with our instruments. Like you have to take that leap into metaphysics, which is really weird.
That is correct. And quantum physics was the first to show that with the measurement problem itself, because it asked what is measurement. You have the act of observation is in measurement, and that's requires some, I guess, level of consciousness. So you have to step into like some other ways of thinking that are more metaphysical and philosophical. So 100%. Yeah, I agree with you.
That stuff is, wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like, and out of like these ideas, so that's like really what we're talking about here is like you've heard the term woo woo, right? Like the woo woo, like think about like feng shui. Feng shui is a really maybe interesting example, or acupuncture, like, the woo-woo, the pseudoscience out there, right? So like Karl Popper was one of the first philosophers of scientists to ask, what distinguishes science from pseudoscience? And continually, like we that distinction, that demarcation, he called it the demarcation problem. Continually to this day, I don't think there's a clear answer, and maybe there's not supposed to be a clear answer. Like I think I read just feng shui, which was considered like woo-woo, by a lot of circles, is now, like they just did a couple of experiments, and it turns out that like there's some real results there that sort of validate the outcomes of feng shui, if not the ontological explanation of feng shui, like that there's these dragon lines passing through, and there's chi out there.
Yeah, the representational model doesn't have to be true. The representational model explaining the thing, it doesn't have to be true, but the thing itself can be valid. Acupuncture too, there's been studies recently showing that there are real effects on inflammation and so forth, like real hard science. I'll look up, I'll put it as a link to this interview, but I read that recently as well.
Yeah. And you use the word true. And so like, that's the whole point, is what is truth? Is truth objective? Is it relative? Is it somewhere in between? And there's a whole, like, philosophers are really working on that problem, and much better than I can represent their work here. But, there's a lot of work.
I have almost like an Aristotelian view on this, on truth, is that I look at truth from the perspective of the concept of utility. If something is useful. So is it true that meditation works? Well, if it does something useful, then it works. Now, my explanations about meditation could be complete BS, right? Well, my theories, there's the mind and there's this and there's that. Yeah, that's just me theorizing, okay? But the practice itself is doing something real. To me, it's like if it's true, if there's utility, it's not exactly the same, because some of our representational models are really robust and are really true, and we can base future experiments on them and so forth. But if something translates to something real, right, then it's true.
Yeah, that's pragmatism, right? I think in a nutshell, like William James, right? Going back to William James and Dewey and those guys, I think pragmatism, right? Charles Sanders Peirce, and I think some of their work, like that truth is sought in pragmatic application and utility and usefulness and things like that.
But I know that's not unanimous. I know a lot of people are so pragmatically is mind body, embodied cognition perspective. We talk about it. We just dipped into the metaphysics of it, but there's also like real, very, very immediate embodied. Like I know you're very involved in different movement practices. I almost say, like, when I see like your explorations into neuro yoga, I look almost like as like movement practices as philosophical explorations, right? Like, so physical things that you'll do that will actually give your brain a workout, or that will change the way you think. And I know your work in neuro yoga, you're a practitioner of that. From your perspective, can developing and engaging the body also help develop and engage the brain and the mind? And give me some concrete examples of how you do that in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole field called neurosports, or sports neuroscience, and we now know different kinds of movement and sports change the brain in a multitude of different ways, helping with memory, helping with learning, helping with thinking, helping with emotional regulation, helping with attention and focus. Running promotes brain-derived neurotrophic factors, which is like fertilizer for the brain, increasing neuroplasticity. That field is huge now, and we now know very well that all different kinds, high-intensity interval training, low-intensity steady state, strength training. A study just came out showing, well, not just came out, maybe like last year or even 2 years ago, that strength decreases white matter lesions in elderly folks. And elderly women. So like the white matter is the parts of the brain, the wires of the brain that connect one part of the brain to another part of the brain. That's called the white matter. It's those axons that connect those parts of the brain. So like there's very rich literature, a lot of data on that as well, just as a whole, right? Like as a whole, the different ways of movement. Walking, for example, changes cognition, creativity, innovation, those kinds of things, decision-making, attention. All of those kinds of things have been studied, different cognitive processes in relation to different types of movement and different kinds of exercise and workout. So I think being multimodal, like doing that's how I live my life. I do a lot of different types of movement that I just explore, and change my way of thinking about myself, right? And how I am, self-image, right? The way I move my body in relation to others, right? When I'm with other people, whether it's my wife or or my child, or just people in another sports team, that kind of thing. And that's embodied cognition. So what I was just talking about is sports neuroscience, but applied embodied cognition is really like, how do we know that, your ability to focus and pay attention and make decisions is relative to your body and how it moves and what's going on in your body and how the body interacts with the environment. So you could design training, you could design processes and methods in different sports to optimize or emphasize that. Same in education, right? Like think about Montessori education or different educational paradigms. Like that is not just like stimulus response, because that's the old paradigm, like the neuroscience, right? Now it's action perception. Um, and so you could design more hands-on, experiential, active, embodied ways of learning that can help with memory and knowledge retention and knowledge acquisition.
You mean being forced to sit down on a desk for 8 hours without like being able to? You're saying that's not optimal to an optimal way of learning.
No, that's correct.
But that comes from the old. That comes from disembodied. That comes from Descartes. That comes from I think therefore I am. It's like you are sitting on a chair thinking, like the brain, the disembodied brain, right? And so now like embodied cognition would change that. I always feel it's crazy, especially for little boys that have got all this energy and all this. And then it's like the teachers call you. The teachers call you and they're like, well, you know, he's talking to his friends and he's getting up. And I'm like, well, I hope he's doing that. Like, you want to put him on pills. And then we prescribe pills like they've got ADD. It's like, maybe they just have energy, you know? Maybe they need to move a little bit more. Maybe they need to go for a little walk. Maybe they need to have a lecture outside. Maybe they need to, you know, play a little bit more sports. I don't know.
And then even on top of that, it actually changes how you learn, right? It changes your ability, like your brain's understanding of the world, right? And it's like a really deep, profound kind of thing. It's incredible.
I'm thinking that old difference between Plato and Aristotle. Plato was the academy, Aristotle was the lyceum. The academy is a top-down education, sit down, listen to the master. The lyceum was the peripatetic school. It's you're walking around and the teacher's moving around. Yeah, you remember the teacher's like telling you about stuff. You're in the market, you're taking a look at something. You talk about this product versus that product. You talk about the nature of the sun. It's much more sort of embodied.
And now think about the use of technology, like virtual reality. So you can do the body transfer illusion like the rubber hand illusion that I talked about in my TED Talk. You can now think about this, like you can like, wow, I just had a thought. Like with the body transfer illusion, they've used virtual reality to make you think you have another body, maybe like another gender or another sex, right? And the experience therein that lies think about the learning and the educational connection we can make with other people and how we could use virtual reality in an embodied way, right? To be able to apply embodied cognition through virtual reality to enhance education. Like in that way, right? That could be really powerful. And therapy too is another example.
Yeah, no, it's really, really interesting. I was thinking also of an experiment I saw where it's like, you know, when we come into contact with something really vast, like mountains or like you know, bodies of water and whatever. Some people get to an age where they can't really move around. Well, maybe with VR, you can give them access to some of those experiences and give them some of those benefits that they can't have in the physical world anymore.
Incredible. Yeah, absolutely. There's all kinds of potential and possibilities. Yeah. And so like that's yeah, I mean, back to your point, I think there's a lot of room for exploration to how like we apply, like once we change our thinking about cognition and who we are in consciousness, then like the application becomes people are going to find new kinds of applications in new fields of domain and new domains all the time.
Before we move on to flow, I want to talk to you about group flow. Just to close the loop on embodied cognition, do you feel like it's something like, not just to use the big word paradigm, but do you feel like it's an emergent paradigm or a different paradigm than the, let's call it mind-body dualism or the disembodied mind paradigm? And as a practitioner in the field, do you feel that there's a little bit of tension there? Do you feel that there's resistance, or a lot of the work is just being done and kind of emerging in a way that's not kind of conflictual? Like, do you have camps? Do you have like little cliques that are like, some people believe this, some people believe that? Like
there are, there's differing views, of course, in the literature. Absolutely. There's a lot of people are still, you know, in the philosophy of mind and philosophy especially, like you always have endless sort of like back and forth and argumentation, which in my personal opinion, might be a drawback of that. But some people might say that's its strength, not a weakness. In science, I think you do have like, you know, we ask questions, we figure out what the data say, and it's very data driven in that way, right? So there's this like empirical objective component to it. In philosophy too, I'm going down a rabbit hole which I shouldn't be going down, but there are different viewpoints. I think like in neuroscience is definitely moving down a direction of if this is what I'm hearing you're asking, neuroscience is definitely converging and moving down a direction that is sort of validating embodied cognition, number one.
Like, is it almost like the emergence of a new paradigm? Not to kind of use that big word just for a big word, but is it similar to a paradigmatic shift where it's like, okay, it's a vastly different understanding, and now we need to start looking at this differently.
So I don't think it's a vastly different understanding. I think I do think science progresses. Like I don't think Kuhn is right, and there's just we move to different paradigms that are incommensurable, from one another, and there's not this I think Kuhn was arguing that there's no scientific progress in that sense. I do think there is a progression. We're advancing our knowledge that is helping us optimize ourselves to the world, in my opinion, and I think neuroscience is definitely making especially the intersection of neuroscience and AI, right? We are now doing amazing things that are going to help a lot of people make life worth living, fulfill purpose. I know that's your thing. We could talk about that. Like even the neuroscience of purpose is, a huge thing. So, like I think it's very exciting. I was going to say something about so artificial intelligence. Going back to that real quickly, it's like if embodied cognition is true, and brains are dynamical systems, complex adaptive dynamical systems that interact with the world, right? Then there's a certain sense where artificial general AGI, artificial general intelligence, might not be possible without embodiment in some way, shape, or form, right? And then so that's very interesting, right? Like so. We talk about narrow AI, we talk about strong AI, but embodied cognition is true. That's going to have some very big ramifications on what the future of AI and thinking about like consciousness and can we make machines conscious and things like that.
And is that because AI is in a sense disembodied? Like, so AI doesn't have a heart, doesn't have a motivational kind of interaction with the environment. So it's funny because just the way you said it now, you've kind of hit the nail on the head. You've kind of pointed at something that I was talking to a friend of mine who's usually very, very optimistic about technology and he's terrified of AI. And because for this exact problem, it's going to turn into a general AI and it's going to take over and so forth. And I was just like, I just get a hunch that we're underestimating HI, that we're like, every time he talks about AIs, it's sort of anthropomorphizing it. It's like it's a biological creature with desires, with the will to dominate, with the will to replicate.
Great. Yeah. Well, what about compassion, empathy? Like you got to humanize those. Like if you're going to I agree with you completely. I am a techno-optimist. Yeah. I was just speaking about this earlier today here at school. I'm definitely a techno-optimist, and I'm concerned, but I'm not scared. I'm not overly anxious at the creation of like these big sci-fi scary robots that are gonna they're gonna be gods, we're gonna be ants.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the evidence from neuroscience and from my field of neuroscience, that is complexity theory, nonlinear dynamical systems, movement, embodied cognition. Though that's what I'm trying to say. Back to your earlier question, that's where neuroscience is going. Like the neural representation theory has been thrown out.
What is that? What is the neural representation theory?
It's like stimulus response, like that, that the brain just responds to stimuli in a way, and that it optimizes for survival. That's neural that the brain creates representations of reality, and it's information processing like a computer. The brain is the hardware, the mind is the software. That's the von Neumann old way of that's not the right way.
That's been thrown out. That's been conclusively thrown out by neuroscience in your view?
I mean, look, there's always going to be detractors, but I would say that's been thrown out. I would say absolutely. My advisor's advisor, Walter Freeman, was one of the first people to prove that you could throw that out. He did amazing experiments where he showed that the way it's not stimulus response, it's response stimulus. A wonderful, prominent neuroscientist out of New York University, colleague George Buzaki, wrote a book called The Brain from the Inside Out. We used to think it was the brain from the outside in, stimulus response. We now know modern neuroscience has, yes, overturned that view. And that's important for the implications of what being scared about artificial intelligence. That's my whole point here that you're also making, and that you made me think of. It's like the brains work from the inside out. And Neil Seth writes this point. It's really brilliant. The brain hallucinates reality, and that's how the brain works. It's a Bayesian prediction engine, and based on movement and the coupling with the environment, as we were talking about earlier. And so, like, it's really like not so much like, hey, there's this machinery in here, and it's a hardware, and you just type in things. The brain creates a mental representation based on environmental stimuli, and it responds to that in an appropriate way. No, it's the other way around. It's the brain is actively, it's more from the inside out, not from the outside in. That's Buzaki's point with the title of his book. And the brain is actively organizing and interpreting and predicting, and it's a dynamical system that changes over time. And so when we think about the brains from that way, that has enormous implications for artificial intelligence. And in my opinion, no one, not Sam Harris, Lex Friedman, like these people out there who are having these conversations are still, giving analogies to this old way of thinking in neuroscience.
Totally agree with you. And it just, for me, I'm not a professional in this field. It just feels a little bit off. It just feels like we're anthropomorphizing. It feels like we're underestimating what goes on in human perception and human consciousness. When I got better acquainted with your work on embodied cognition, I think that seems a lot more kind of in tune with what's really going on. It's kind of this very rich combination of experiences, sensorial experiences, emotional experiences, interactions with the environment, and then memory. You also mentioned memory, right? This kind of evolution of identities and these broader constructs that we build our lives around.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Compassion, empathy, as we mentioned, memory, all of those things, emotional regulation, which is largely involved in movement, breath, which is so interoception. We now know so much about, and I don't want to get away from my thought about artificial intelligence, but interoception is another example. Like being able to sense what's going on the inside affects cognition and thinking and decision-making and attention and all of these kinds of things. People with higher levels of interoceptive sensitivity and accuracy are higher levels of mental well-being and mental wellness. That's well known now. And so, like, all of those, the breath is an amazing connection between the body and the brain. And so back to artificial intelligence. So, like, I was going to say, this notion of embodied cognition. So, again, I just want to preface this with a caveat that I could be wrong. We don't really know, there could be multiple instantiations or multiple systems out there that could fit the bill to produce consciousness. This is one way. The wetware inside of here with a connection to a body and a spine and moving, exploring, and sensing with sensors, that's one way that consciousness and empathy and all these things happen. It might not be the only way. Right? Like, it might turn out that, the brain is really an information processing device. I mean, I totally think the brain does process information in the Shannonian, for your listeners, like a Shannon entropy and information, computational, let's just say way, of course, but I think that if the neuroscience is really moving away from that.
Like, it's not reduced to that. It's not only that is what you're saying.
Correct. I mean, yeah, exactly. So, but like this, even still, it still attenuates and mitigates this argument of like AGI is going to be gods and we're going to be ants and, like that kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. So one expression that you had, I think, is a perfect segue between the concept of embodied cognition and the concept of flow, and that's controlled perception, right? Csikszentmihalyi talks about flow as order in consciousness, right? Ordering your consciousness from moment to moment. And so you're also the chief science officer for the Flow Research Collective, founded by Stephen Kotler, whose work is amazing. And if anybody is not cognizant of it, I think definitely strongly recommended. But there's a rich scientific literature and experimentation around the concept of flow. So just quick recap, these states where people feel amazing and also perform at their best. Csikszentmihalyi always says that, we don't feel at our best when we're on a hammock sipping a drink. We feel at our best when we're actively challenging ourselves with something, growing from the experience, bringing order in consciousness, transcending our limitations. Athletes talk about being in the zone. So kind of being fully focused and immersed on an activity, having 100% focus around the thing that we're doing. And it's not just peak performers. There was a lot of initial work around flow for peak performers. It's also ordinary people who, report having more happiness and joy and purpose when they experience more flow and engagement in their lives. So there's obviously the concept of flow, and that's a whole huge thing. But I want to direct your attention on an aspect of flow that doesn't have as maybe rich a literature, that people are maybe less aware of, and that you're very involved in researching and in studying, and that's group flow. So entering kind of flow states as a group, right? Not just as an individual, but also as a group. So the difference between an agglomeration of individuals, everybody being active, and a synchronized group, right, around shared goals, maybe shared values even. I don't know. Can you talk a little bit about the science of flow as it relates specifically to group flow, and what can maybe lead to it? Because I know that's an area that you've researched a lot and very deeply.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to unpack there. Let me see if I can. And I think I got a Neil Seth's quote in my head. It just came back to me as you were talking too. So I'll put that back on the back burner for now. Group flow is this phenomenon and it's collective flow, shared flow, team flow. There's a bunch of ways to sort of phrase it. And it's been studied now psychologically. Keith Sawyer studied it. He was one of Csikszentmihalyi's first students, or a student of his. And there are certain sets of, triggers or preconditions that make group flow more likely. A guy named J.J. Vandenhout I think his work is like sort of top notch and state of the art when it comes to team flow. And he talks about, team flow is when you're actively pursuing goals, right? There's a shared goal commitment. There's a collective ambition, and there's open communication, and there's mutual commitment, and there's high skill integration, and there's psychological safety, and there's shared goals and aligned personal goals. When those 7 prerequisites, are dialed up and existing, you get this idea of collective flow. Of team flow. And team flow, what are the characteristics that show up? A sense of unity, a holistic progress, trust. So those are these characteristics that show up when all those 7 prerequisites sort of are met and are dialed up and they're existing. And so, and it's interesting that team flow has been studied now at the level of the brain. So flow itself, individual flow, has really been studied at the level of the brain. And, although there's differing data sets out there and differing data and different experiments, we can now conclusively say that flow is a real thing at the level of the brain. Individual flow is a real thing at the level of the brain, right? It's not just a psychological thing.
Yeah, it's measured.
It's measured at the level of the brain. And now it turns out there's one study, just one, that came out in 2021 that showed that team flow also has a neuromarker at the level of the brain, but not of one brain, of many brains. In this case, not many, 2 brains, because they studied dyads. And it turns out that team flow or group flow, or team flow, let's say in this case, because they studied team flow, is not just the addition of a bunch of individuals each in flow. Team flow itself is a nonlinear whole is greater than the sum of the parts state that exists not only in, so there's a neuromarker that correlates with team flow, but that neuromarker doesn't exist in one brain. You have to look at the system.
Oh,
It
really?
only exists at the system level.
How does that work? How is that measured?
It's measured with different ways of looking at brain activity and consciousness, like really advanced statistical methods using, integrated information theory.
It's a relational thing between the brains. It's not necessarily something that you can measure at the individual brain level.
That is correct. That is correct. You just framed it very nicely and articulated it perfectly. And you can use integrated information theory, this theory of consciousness that I was actually referring to earlier in this conversation, they use that. And they showed that team flow was really a global thing that exists at the system level. And so those are some of the antecedents to team flow. And another antecedent, so there's still a lot of research and open questions about, how to measure team flow, what's the framework around it, what are the actual antecedents. One of them is yes, synchrony, interpersonal synchrony has been studied. And they studied this in this paper. They found that the brains synchronize. There's the level of interpersonal synchrony. Brain waves sync up. Not only in team flow, but just in collaboration in general. We know that teams on the same wavelength perform better. Brain waves sync up, like a pilot and a co-pilot. Their brain waves literally sync up when they're taking off and performing the same task at the same time. Not only brain waves, but like heart rates, respiratory rates, galvanic skin response, a bunch of other markers, biomarkers, physiological biomarkers synchronize when people that predicts group cohesion and team performance and trust, cooperation.
Performance must be, so I'm thinking like at the individual level, when you look at the way individual performance skyrockets when people are in flow, I would assume that there are performance benefits at the group level when the group enters this kind of synchronous like group flow state.
100%.
And so it would almost be like, okay, when we're a bunch of selfish individuals that each have their own personal goal, it would seem like the group loses something. Is that an idea that you can vibe with?
Yes, I can vibe with that for sure. Like when you have aligned personal goals, that adds to the group and the collective ambition. Yes, 100%. Especially with like the task that you're trying to do or the problem that you're trying to solve or decision that you're trying to make or as a group. And so, yes, absolutely. And performance does increase. I mean, not only when people get in sync, performance increases. Like not only in music or sports, as those are paradigmatic examples, but like just putting something together with your hands, or figuring out you have a problem to solve together, and you've done experiments, like all kinds of scientific experiments out there, where they get people in sync and then the performance goes up, rather than if they're just working together but not in sync.
Is there anything that can knock the group out of flow, like certain behaviors or certain? I guess one of the 7 triggers that you mentioned, like if one of them were removed, or if. But this is like, what could knock a group out of flow, where it could like the performance would go down and the synchrony would go down?
Great question. So some of the original group flow triggers that Keith Sawyer looked at were like ego blending, equal participation, familiarity, like open communication, familiarity. There's a trigger called yes and, so being additive, right, to the conversation. If you're in a situation where you're having a conversation, that's not going to. The yes and doesn't apply, to a jazz quartet or, a football team. But so he studied improv and he studied jazz musicians actually as well. So yeah, those are the group flow triggers. If they're not all there or they're not all dialed up, flow exists in a spectrum. So does group flow, I believe. I think the research will bear that out. First of all. But then there are, I guess, group flow blockers, just as there are individual flow blockers. Distraction, limited beliefs, self-sabotage, overwhelm, those kinds of things are.
Would you put like I don't know why I had this idea when you mentioned interruptions or just tuning out of the moment. University students surfing on social media while the teacher is I don't know if you have that at the university there, but I have a lot of my friends teach at the university level, and they just say like, look, you can't say anything because if you say anything, they'll give you a bad rating as a prof. It's almost like there's like the client relationship now, but that behavior doesn't seem to be conducive to group flow or like establishing some kind of a synchronous group dynamic around the exploration of an idea or learning.
Yeah, no, the research out of Susan Dicker's lab at University of Montreal and one of my colleagues, Guillaume Dumas, they've studied education and this idea of synchrony in education. And they found out that when students are paying to get attention together, you hit the nail on the head, man. When they found a neuromarker of joint attention when students were focused on the same lesson and paying attention together in a classroom. And they were students in a classroom with EEG sets on their heads, and they were focused on the same lesson, and they found a joint neuromarker for attention. So that is, this joint neuromarker is a neuromarker for attention, but it only exists at the joint group level of the students. So learning and memory enhances when students get into sync. And so you can actually, like, if we're going to take a test together, let's all get calm together. Or if we're about to learn a lesson, let's all pay attention together and know that we're all paying attention and we have a shared goal and that kind of thing. So that's been shown, like interpersonal synchrony in education for paying attention has been shown.
Wow. Such a fascinating science, group flow, because I find that as a society, a lot of our challenges will require group. We can't just solve it as a bunch of like separated and like selfish individuals. We're going to have to attack shared problems, turn them into shared goals, and then become effective as groups. And I find that this science of group flow that's kind of, or team flow, collaborative flow that's emerging. It's just refreshing how, first of all, it's completely apolitical, right? It's really just structured around, we can talk about what the goals should be, but to the extent that we can agree on goals, and to the extent that we can agree on problems, we're going to have to get better as a species in this kind of practice of group flow, find ways to kind of sync up together as productive teams and attack these complex problems, as opposed to, I don't know, just endlessly arguing over minutia detail to figure out who gets the power, to figure out who is the top monkey in the hierarchy, that we currently have, like attacking these problems like politically or through a culture war paradigm. It's like, okay, like let's agree there's a problem. There's a level of the problem at which we can agree that there is a problem. Okay. Now, how do we mobilize our attention and our resources as a group to solve that problem? So I find it's a great, it's a really, really cool discipline that's emerging, and with the scientific understanding backing it up, that it's really an area where I hope there's more research, more attention, more awareness that gets built around that, because it's potentially really really unbelievable from a human progress perspective.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, man. And Stephen Kotler actually makes this point very well at the end of his book that he wrote with Peter Diamandis, The Future is Faster Than You Think. This idea of the hive mind, and the group flow is the state on the most pleasurable state on the planet that everybody knows that and experiences it. If you've experienced group flow or team flow, it is, it's like all of the pleasure chemistry that you get and motivation chemistry that you get in individual flow, which is a very pleasurable state, is like amplified when you're a group flow. And so he makes the point that this is what we need to tackle these global problems. He makes the point that you're making right now, and we need to figure out collaboration, how to collaborate, but getting in that state facilitates cooperation and collaboration and human connection. And so getting in sync is part of that equation. And we absolutely need to figure out how to do that. I think when we learn how to do that, when we learn how to get in sync, we learn how to take each other's perspectives. And this has actually been shown. Guillaume, one of my colleagues, as I mentioned before, at University of Montreal, has shown empathy increases when we get in sync. Okay, so like between mother and child, between strangers, between friends, like when we get in sync, literally, and I'm not talking about like, hey, we're in sync, colloquially. I'm talking about like biologically when we get in sync, when we're in synchrony, empathy, those things increase so we can take each other's perspective, because there's two kinds of empathy. There's affective empathy, like, literally putting yourself in, not literally putting yourself in someone's shoes, but you're feeling literally the way they feel. So you're putting yourself in their shoes. And then there's cognitive empathy, which is taking their perspective on a more intellectual level, not so much the affective level, but the cognitive level. And he showed that those two happen when people get into sync. So think about like conflict resolution, disagreeing about same-sex marriage, disagreeing about gun regulation and these kinds of things. So those things, in my opinion, I'm very passionate about critical thinking, and I think critical thinking, if people learn to think critically and the skills and strategies therein, will help those situations. But even more than that, just going beyond that, from an intellectual critical thinking, getting into sync and getting into group flow will be the way we can really affect those at the level of brain. Again, I can take your perspective, I can understand where you're coming from, and we can then, resolve conflicts, tackle problems, and understand each other better.
Find pragmatic solutions to these problems in a way that incorporates the perspectives of others, and not just kind of forcing your perspective through, for example, a political solution or a legal solution, and locking out millions of people out. So it's very interesting. There are a lot of implications here at the social organization level that touch sort of every level, from like individual to small team to bigger team, to sort of, okay, now we've got a community, right, in a large territory, all the way up to these really big problems. Really fascinating area.
Fred, it shouldn't be lost on the viewers that it can go the other way too. Like flow is value neutral, right? Like, so is group flow. Think about National Socialism. Think about the Nazis. Think about there was a lot of group flow there, probably.
Around the wrong goal. So I guess the goal discussion is the kind of primordial one that we need to have and agree on as a society. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I want to end with a kind of a weird one for you, because you sometimes in your work, it's clear that you're doing real peer-reviewed, data-driven science at the highest level with computer models and so forth. But once in a while, you'll let a word like soul or spirit through, okay? And I know that you have this kind of multimodal, multi-layered conception of consciousness, of the human spirit, and I don't know why I connected to the notion also of free will up to a certain point, because it's like, to what degree can we direct consciousness? To what degree are we kind of a harmonious, integrated, conscious creature, which a lot of materialists believe that we're not. Again, this kind of I forget which one it was. I think it's the stimulus response model. But what do you think of these notions, like soul, like spirit? Were they metaphors that we, like maybe proto-science, like metaphors that we came up with in different religious traditions or spiritual traditions that we can now maybe understand in a more sophisticated way through scientific means? Or is it just a manner of speech? How do you see these concepts playing out?
Well, it's interesting you say the matter of speech, because going back to embodied cognition, George Lakoff wrote a book called Metaphors We Live By. And that was actually one of the first instantiations of embodied cognition. Warm, we move, we think of the future, we move forward. We think of the past, we move backward. And we use metaphors, and those metaphors are embodied kind of things in the way we move our bodies. And so they actually have a lot of traction with meaning and cognition itself. But to answer your question, I think there's a great quote from Carl Sagan, one of my biggest gurus and heroes. He says, science is not only compatible with spirituality, it's also a profound source of spirituality. And I'm very spiritual. I'm a physicalist. I'm a materialist. I don't think there's anything sort of non-physical out there, but I think there are emergent properties that we discussed earlier that can maybe be described as non-physical, that can't be reduced to physical things. So when we're talking about brass tacks here, I don't think there's any such thing as spirit or soul in addition to something that is already here. I don't know what work it would do. I don't know what function it would serve. I can't, I don't think and I don't really think there's probably any evidence to that effect. Having said that, I mean, if you want to talk about consciousness, like in other words, agency, there's some other soul, our soul has agency that was given from outside, right? Like outside of like what came up and it emerged from evolution and from physics itself. I don't think like that's what I'm talking about. I don't think there's anything like that. But having said that, enormously spiritual myself, like just in consciousness in general. I think the beauty of consciousness is that it gives us the ability to reach out. This is Freeman's point, not my point. My advisor's advisor, Walter Freeman. Again, Freeman was one of the first people to really apply mathematics and chaos theory to the brain to try and understand the brain at that level, a computational neuroscientist. And he threw out the old neural representation view of cognitive neuroscience that we were talking about earlier. But like intentionality, not from philosophy of mind, intentionality from like neuroscience. Like the consciousness can give us this ability to reach out and discover the world and make the world more like us and make us more like the world. And that's a really powerful thing. We can do so many things with that and connect with each other so much better. And that's a very spiritual thing for me.
So I'm interested because you defined agency as something that would come from the outside, but I'm curious. And then the emergent properties, could agency just be an emergent property that nonetheless gives us the ability to have something like an intention, to have something like self-awareness or wanting to like intentionally moving our consciousness from one place to the next?
Yes. And I want to give an experiment that was done too, and I want to talk about that real quick. But yes, that's the way I look at agency, right? And Stuart Kaufman talked about this as well. So I think consciousness. I don't know if Stephen Kotler and we're writing a paper on this actually right now. Believe it or not, and we are on intuition and agency and consciousness and what comes first and that kind of thing. So, but it's really, really. So what I would say is that I think in terms of like free will, and I mean I'm by no means an expert in the philosophy of free will or the neuroscience of free will with like experiments that were done, showing that there's no such thing as free will at the level of the brain, blah blah blah, which have been talked about at length, right? Which about. Yeah. So like, I mean, it depends really, of course, how you operationalize free will and define free will. And that's been largely the problem. So we can say, yes, it exists. On one hand, we can direct consciousness. I think we have the ability to direct consciousness to pay attention to what we want to pay attention to. Going back to Csikszentmihalyi, he said the optimal state of consciousness is one in which there's order in consciousness. The optimal state of inner experience is one in which there's order in consciousness, what you said. And that I think like is the ability for us to be able to direct that and get into a flow state. That gives us agency, and that allows us that's one of the beautiful things about being human, I think, and other animals as well. So there's a really interesting experiment that was done with babies. She was looking at Rove Collier. I'm not pronouncing her name right, but she was looking at babies and she was looking at infant memory, and she did the infant mobile conjugate experiment where the baby was connected to the mobile, right? Like this was the mobile above the baby's in the crib, and she connected a ribbon to the baby's leg, and then connected that ribbon to the mobile. And so before she connected it, the baby's just looking at the mobile and blah blah blah, and enjoying the movement of the mobile, and amused is the word I'm looking for. When the baby gets connected to the mobile, it starts, the spontaneous kicks of the baby's leg go from non-spontaneous to like, oh my God, I can make the mobile move more, and that's making me being amused more. So there's a positive feedback loop. You see what I'm saying? So when the baby was connected to the mobile with the ribbon, the leg movements went from spontaneous to like non-spontaneous, like organized, intentional, like, I realize I'm making the mobile move. She was studying infant memory. Do infants remember? And Scott Kelso, one of my advisors at the Center for Complex Systems and Brain Sciences, where I did my PhD, replicated that experiment, but with mathematics and with the laws of coordination dynamics. And they replicated the data, and they found that's really powerful because that explains the data that she found. It describes it and makes predictions about the data, and they extrapolated that or interpreted that there is agency, like there's a self-organized coupling between the baby's movements and the environment, the world, and out of that comes this eureka, like I'm like, wow, I'm doing that. That's like it's a self. Out of that comes self, right? And Rudolfo Linas made this point with when I was making the predictive imperative as well. So yeah, I think neuroscience is now explaining this idea of agency. Now, to get back to spirituality and the soul, you asked this really personal question. So I was trying to
No, it's good. I think you've reconstructed very quickly, but an alternative understanding of agency that doesn't require an external agent putting in
self-organization.
Yeah, self-organization. That's right.
Self-organization, that's the key. Hurricanes, all of these biological and ecological systems that come out of self-organization, the brain, consciousness, agency, it's a self-organized process. And that is like enormously spiritual, like, in a very, how can you not be like wowed and awed by like what's going on in the universe?
And it's a deeply relational self. It's not just an individual self. Like it's not just a ghost of like one human being. It's now something that's also a function of not only the laws of nature, but all these surrounding entities that contribute to the formation of the self. So you can have agency, but that agency includes a relationship with the outside.
Yes, that's my point. Like that's exactly my point. Like you and I are related. We are related. Like you look at an ant, you're related to that ant. Like literally, like a cousin, right? Like we are all cousins. Like think about that. Like you go back far enough, and you will come to an individual, not that far, by the way, right? Like who spawned people that spawned you and I. All human beings are related. They're cousins. All life on the planet is related. When you think about that, and you think about like now the possibilities in the universe, like you have to just stand in awe of the results of what science is showing us that, in my opinion, theological could not even come like theological theories in these different systems could not even come close to like the craziness that a science is unveiling. And that for me is very spiritual.
Yes, but the level at which we're interconnected, I know I was thinking of Paul Stamets' work and how the mycelium are kind of like this network. There's this conscious sub-network that connects all of life, and like without them we can't live, and we kind of co-evolved with them over the hundreds, thousands, millions of years, who knows, and how like now we live in this kind of co-evolved relational state with them. I mean, that's why there's forms of communication that can occur between different living beings. Again, I don't know of like traditional religious doctrines that are as mind-bending and unbelievably awe-inspiring as that, and it emerges from a lot of scientific work.
Yes, exactly. I started to interrupt you. I was like, some of them are kind of boring. Like they're fantastical stories, but when you look at them compared to like what science is unveiling, they're like, they like, wow, okay. Some of them are not boring, maybe like Scientology, like these fantastical, like stories and that kind of thing. Maybe, but there are stories that the mind comes up with, but which is based on our experience and our confirmation bias and our experience of the world. When we move to science, it's very counterintuitive. What? Like, wait, you and I are related? Like, wait a second. Like, wait, an electron can be in two places at one time? Like, wait, time travel is possible? Like, like there's a multiverse. There's people. There's probably life on other planets. Like, wait a second. You're telling me like I'm looking at the sun. I'm looking at the past, 8 minutes in the past. Like because it takes 8 minutes for the light from the sun to get here. In fact, when you like look at anything, you're always looking at it in the past because it takes time for the light to travel and then your information to process the brain. So you're always seeing the past. You're not seeing the now. But then Einstein comes along with relativity and says, like, actually, there's no such thing as the now. Like, time is relative. It's not an absolute thing that marches on, depending on how fast you're moving with one another. And it's like you go through all these scientific facts that we've discovered, and they're so freaking counterintuitive. It's like you have to just stand in awe of these kinds of things, and it's like it's amazing. It's just incredibly fascinating, amazing. That's my part of my purpose, is understanding that.
Unbelievable. So look, I mean, I think this is a great way to end this conversation. I'm going to put your encyclopedic knowledge of all these different studies and books to the test. Where I'm going to come up with a little list. We've got the transcript. We're going to come up with a little like reading list based on this conversation and kind of lump it together in themes, because I think this could be an amazing jumping off point for a lot of people to explore a lot of these different concepts. And I'm going to vet that list with you, because I mean, it's unbelievable what you came up with. Just the references in this talk alone could be a multi-year exploration for people into all these different interconnected questions.
It's so many. Thanks. I just love, I've been inspired by a lot of people, and I just love referencing their work and their books. And another one that you made me think of, like, throughout the conversation, which I didn't even mention, is Gödel, Escher, and Bach by Douglas Hofstadter, which is one of my top 3 books. It's just an absolute game changer for me. And for many people, like, he really started computational science and computer science. And I can rattle off a bunch of books too right now, but that one, you made me think of that during our conversation when we were talking about analogy. He talked about analogy as the core of cognition, being able to compare and contrast things, and which is a very embodied relational thing, right? And so, yeah, Gödel, Escher, Bach.
Amazing. I'm glad you got to mention it. And listen, with all the amazing work that you're doing with Stephen, with others, the Flow Research Collective, the AI Lab at Miami-Dade, I'm going to look forward to having this conversation again with you, just to kind of keep pace with all these different interesting ideas that you're working with, and all these different explorations that you're going under, and kind of merging all these different concepts together: the embodied cognition, the flow, the AI, the nature of cognition. Love it. I just think it's super fascinating.
Yeah, Fred. Thanks. I'm happy to come back, and amazing questions you asked. It's very intuitive, insightful questions, and just thank you for your work too in Purpose and your TED Talk. And I just want to reciprocate. It's just been incredibly inspiring, and sure to inspire a lot of other people to help find their purpose, and keeping these conversations open. Like, this was such a wonderful conversation. I definitely got into interpersonal flow because I just looked at the time. I was like, oh my God, that was like an hour and 36 minutes. I thought, like, I did not realize. So like, time flew by, man. So yeah, great. Super fun.
Yeah, I love it. It's so cool. And yeah, like, some linking our approaches is also my kind of holy grail, is a rational evidence-based approach to meaning and purpose. So I don't think that you need to think of these things as kind of from the perspective of received religions or rejected with a materialist scientific perspective. I do believe that there's a science and rational frameworks emerging where we can understand these things in a way that's compatible with science. So I think that's one of the things that kind of links up our approaches.
Yeah, 100%, man. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Talk to you soon. All right.
All right, Fred. Thank you so much for the conversation, man.